Hello and welcome to part 2 on the challenges of inequality and environmental degradation. The second half of the symposium was chaired by Associate Professor Dan Hikuroa of Māori Studies, with the second panel comprising of Professor Emilson Silva from the Business School, Dr. Lynn Riggs of Motu Research, and Dr. David Hall of Social Sciences and Humanities.
It's my honour and privilege to introduce our next session. I have a confession to make that I'm not an economist. I know very little about tax other than I have to pay it. And my background is actually in science, but I work a lot in the environment space, I work a lot in the sustainability space, and I work a lot within and for communities. And so I'm going to introduce some alternative ideas, or maybe reintroduce some ideas that have been forgotten, or maybe have been suppressed for a time, in the interest of adding to the debate and adding to the dialogue. And I think the first thing I'll challenge is the assumption that capitalism is the way forward. And I'll just put that out there initially, remembering that there were other ideas of economy that existed before the capitalist approach that we bring. I will also introduce some ideas that come from an Indigenous worldview, an Indigenous approach, and specifically from a Māori one. Not in an effort to say we need to go back to that or we need to reintroduce that, but just to say there are ideas that are very ancient that appear to have been forgotten or kind of marginalised or put to the side, that maybe we could reintroduce into this dialogue. In some of the work I've done with Indigenous peoples around the world, we try to come to a collective understanding about what the Indigenous experience was and what it meant, and what some of the aspirations and the things that drove decision makers in Indigenous leadership roles. And we landed on this idea of being a good ancestor. And to be very clear, that's not inconsistent with some of the messages that we heard at our panel this morning. But what it does is very significantly shift the time frame around the decisions we think of. Another aspect of the Indigenous experience is that we see ourselves as part of the environment, not separate from it. And if we draw back from some other economists, and I'm in danger here of knowing one or two, and I know there's very learned folks in the room, but Herman Daly, who was the World Bank economist, said that the economy is entirely the subsidiary of the environment. And so if the environment is not in good shape, then anything else that's reliant upon that is therefore probably not going to be in good shape either. Now, we do recognise that there's a lag effect that we've enjoyed for some time, but that's really beginning to come home now. Climate change is a direct result of a mindset, a capitalist mindset of resource use and consumption based on the premise that we are separate from nature. And from that comes a set of accepted norms and understandings about what we can and should or indeed are encouraged to do by the taxation and the legal settings and by the understandings of what's good or what's desirable. If we instead think about what some of the leadership qualities of Māori leaders, of rangatira are, they were to ensure that the health and well-being of the taiao, the environment, and the people that you were, the political unit for which you were in charge of making decisions for, once those were taken care of, and I also need to be crystal clear that it wasn't that Māori or indeed Indigenous peoples did not extract from the environment. That every society and culture has done that. But it's the rules by which they did that and engaged with that which are very, very different. When you see the river as your ancestor and you see the mountain as your ancestor and you seek to derive user privileges from that rather than ownership rights that can be commodified and sold as tradable markets, near and sunder is some of the kind of the differences there. And so once the well-being of the people and the taiao, the environment of which humans are part, was taken care of, in traditional Māori society, the way in which you operated was you didn't accumulate wealth, you distributed the wealth. And I'll introduce here this idea of mana. Now I'm sure it's a term that many of you will at least have heard of, but maybe not as many of you have dived deep into. And in fact, in this building, I was very privileged to have some amazing discussions, and there's been some amazing research that's come out around ideas of economies of mana. And I note that there is an author on an amazing paper that came out in 2018, which is actually, and I'm going to read a little bit from the extract, breaking all of the best teaching pedagogy rules, but it's important for me to just get this right. And so it says, writings on traditional Māori economies have highlighted the value system that philosophically underpins them and the relational nature of trading interactions. Further, the significance of mana in sustaining economic relationships has been emphasised, leading to the concept of an economy of mana. In the paper, they explore traditional Māori economies, the concept of mana, and the limited exploration of an economy of mana in order to propose future research directions for Māori economic research. And indeed, I think we can broaden that to say, what can the rest of us learn from that approach? It's their contention that enhancing our understanding of where we want to go will ultimately support the development of alternative economies that will better provide for Māori aspirations in cultural, social and economic realms. And without wanting to simplify, I have no doubt that those will flow out to the rest of Aotearoa New Zealand. And just to share some examples of what that looks like, they propose 10 principles, and maybe I'll share a link afterwards, and those of you that are interested can pick this up. And I'm at principle 1 is under the framing of how people make decisions, recognising that this has already come up in panel 1 this morning. Principle 1 is we increase the collective good. The point there being the collective good. We've already noted in really great detail how the collective good is really not being emphasised at the moment. Principle 2, the intergenerational long-term outlooks, bringing in that idea of being a good ancestor. Principle 3, mandated and authorised by the people. It also picks up on ideas that have come forward. So there's nothing too allergic happening at all here. And principle 4, guided by mana-enhancing behaviours. Now that takes a little bit more unpacking. We won't have time to do that now, so I really want to privilege our speakers. But I'll just run through the last few principles. And this one relates to the theme of how people interact. It's already been an appeal from Craig and others that we actually need a better conversational space. I don't think anyone disagreed with that. And they propose that you can relate through shared experiences. And there's a desire to maintain a sense of belonging and connection with each other. And then under the theme of how the economy works as a whole, but I think that underpin many of the other discussion points, that we interact with the 4 well-beings, and these are listed here as spiritual, ecological, kinship and economic. So not the 4 well-beings of the RMA, but 4 different well-beings. There's a focus on wealth distribution, as I mentioned earlier, as opposed to wealth accumulation. The world provides abundance as opposed to scarcity and competition. And the entire world is a kinship network of all living things. And just to give us a bit of a backdrop for why some of those ideas may have been kind of minimised and suppressed, we need to think right back to some of the early politicians. Christopher William Richmond, the First Minister of Native Affairs, complained of the social equality among Māori tribes, describing their communal ties as the beastly communism of the natives. He wanted to destroy what he called that by introducing private property and land. So we could argue that it's those very steps, and if we've already noticed here that if land is part of that accumulation of wealth, that we can stem it right back. There's a point in time where we can bring it to. And as was also mentioned by others this morning, the economy is entirely a choice we make, or choices we choose to not make. I'm simply arguing for, is capitalism the best way forward? And maybe what I'm describing is perhaps what's being described as inclusive capitalism. Bringing in ideas of mana as we work in and alongside this vision of Aotearoa New Zealand that we so desperately wish for, and in fact we need. Places like this gives us a place to dream and to dare to dream just a little, and I encourage us to do that. But we also need the mission that goes with it. Because if we're just dreaming, we're just up in the clouds, and if we're just about mission, we're just running around with our heads cut off. If we can weave those two together, we might get into a really amazing space. And just to pick on to bring out one example that's already been mentioned this morning, and I appreciate your comments, Honourable David Parker, on the ETS saying it was an attempt. It's imperfect. It could do with an improvement. Because what we're actually seeing is that it's privileged certain species at the cost of other types of forestry. and we're seeing those profound negative effects. And so, do we throw out the idea of that? Probably not, but do we need to refine and tweak and adjust what we actually value and maybe some of the data and information that leads into that? Hopefully, I've done my job there of really bending your minds just a little bit, and that I've created a fertile garden for which our panellists this morning can then plant their ideas into, and that we might get into some great discussion coming up.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I am an economics professor, so then I will present the topic from an economic perspective. I will focus on some principles, efficiency, equity, discuss that, give a little bit of detail. I am a professor after all, then I'm going to start with some basics, and then I will build on that, looking at, say, one example where in practice we have redistributive pricing. That's going to be for the United States in energy. Then I'll look at some dynamic effects. So how does the economic growth affect inequality? So looking at the Kuznets curve. And then I'll talk about the environmental Kuznets curve. How does that affect the environment? And then I'll close with a recent paper that I have in which we have well-intended policies, but then we have also some unintended consequences. So, basic economic principles using mainstream economics, the orthodox, is based first on efficiency and equity. Benchmark that we have, under some assumptions, every competitive market equilibrium is Pareto efficient. So this is what we call the first fundamental welfare theorem. It's a remarkable achievement given what we have there, but then it's a representation of Adam Smith's invisible hand claim. What is Pareto efficiency? So Pareto efficiency, an allocation of resources is Pareto efficient if it is not possible to make an individual better off without making another individual worse off, given the resources that we have available. First, welfare theorem assumptions. What are those? First, a complete set of markets, so it rules out externalities, public goods, and asymmetry of information. In particular, externalities is something that we should care about because that involves the environmental degradation issues. Households and firms are price takers, so they cannot influence price. So it rules out market power. Well, when we go and analyze this, then we have to confront ourselves with two types of economic views or perspective. One is normative. So it's normative economics. An analysis is normative when it is based on value judgments involving a pre-established criteria. And positive economics, which is why markets and institutions have evolved as they have and how they work. So when we talk about social efficiency, so like we're thinking in terms of a society, how can we aggregate all these members in society in order to express the views of society? So that is a concept that is basically normative, because there are competing ways in which we can look at that particular issue. So a Pareto efficient competitive equilibrium, suppose even under those assumptions which are not realistic, which I will refer to them, even though it may be efficient, it may not be socially efficient. Why? Because society may disagree about how resources are distributed. So the competitive equilibrium outcome may not be socially equitable. It would be necessary then to redistribute the resources, wealth, income, among households to implement the socially efficient allocation. How can that be done? Well, that could be done in principle with transfers that would be non-distortionary. But that's very difficult to do. So we can then implement a set of taxes that are distortionary in terms of distorting the behavior of the individuals. And so we should try to look at what is the tax that causes the least amount of distortion. The reality check. First, we have an incomplete set of markets. Existence of externalities, environmental degradation. We have public goods. For example, abatement of greenhouse gases. That's one key example. Do we observe income levels? Do we observe pollution levels? I would say no, not perfectly. Market power in various markets, actually that seems to be the rule rather than the exception. We have an existence of a social planner. Even though we may have a social objective, but we don't have anyone with the power to actually dictate what should be done. So instead, what we have are political economy choices. We have voting mechanisms. We have voting choices. And we must not neglect dynamic drivers. So what are the dynamic drivers? Entrepreneurship, which is key in the system. So ideas. So if we have inventive ideas, innovation. So that's how the system actually grows. We have these incentives for people to innovate. We should not try to inhibit those. We should actually motivate this type of activities. And we have population changes. We have mobility across different regions. And we have also changes in demographic changes, like the graying of the population, which I would say it is one of the key types of problems that we should address nowadays. In addition to, say, the climate change issue, also the graying of the population, the social security is a key. And we have evolution of labor skills, given the evolution of technologies. So the first one is an example of redistributive electricity pricing in the United States. So here's an example where using the mainstream economics, you can actually design a set of policies or prices that would account for inequality. And that's what we have done in this paper. Silva is myself, and then Emilson is a co-author of mine. So we actually look at the theory, and then put that into the practice using data from the United States to see whether the regulators in the United States effectively accounted for income inequalities within their particular jurisdictions. And the answer to that question is yes, they do. Yes, that is taken into account. However, electricity pricing contributes little to reducing income inequality because of informational issues. So instead of focusing on income, then the systems are focused on what is observable, consumption of electricity. And there is a weak correlation between consumption of electricity and income. Now, let's talk about some dynamic drivers. So the first one, which is key to this whole issue over here that we are discussing, is how does economic growth affect the distribution of income in a particular society? How does that affect income inequality? So the first claim was done by Kuznets, which then said, well, in a particular society, in the period of economic growth, the income inequality it gets worse, but then eventually it gets better. Okay? So it increases, but then it falls as the economy grows. So that has been put to the test. Recent data demonstrates, especially for developed countries, demonstrates that, in fact, that is only part of the story. So let me just say one paper that I recommend, which is a recent study for Canada. Canada is among the OECD nations the one that seems to be the one that has the greatest amount of income inequality, especially if you look at across different types of regions. So in this paper, they look at regional data and then try to evaluate this question. What do they find? They find that first, population is an important factor. So there is a correlation between, say, income inequality and population density, in particular in large cities. Second, the common trend appears to be, what they find is a sideways S. Think of a picture over here where I'll put over here in a graph. So we have income per capita over here, and then we have Gini coefficient, which is a measure of how unfair the distribution of income is. Okay? So what they find is that first there is an inverted U, which is the Kuznets inverted U. But then what we have seen more recently is that then that's followed by a U-shaped, which means that as the economy grows, then income becomes more uneven distributed. So the top is getting a greater share of the whole overall income than the bottom. So the students, what do they attribute this phenomenon to? A lot of the studies, what they have observed is that the manufacturing mix shifting away from mass producer consumer goods towards more advanced and technologically intensive sectors where a disproportionately large share of workers are among the top income earners. So we have seen in many of the developed countries through the process of development where we have outsourcing, then the manufacturing sector has been outsourced to, say, developing countries, but then the concentration of R&D and other types of activities that are more inventive have their headquarters in these large countries, like the United States, for example. What about the environment? So for the environment, there is, in the same line on the Kuznets curve, then there is the inverted U environmental Kuznets curve. So is it true that first the environment deteriorates for some level of income, and then the quality actually improves afterwards? So then we have the inverted U in terms of that. So pollution goes down. So that is a claim that was initially done by two economists in the United States in the 1990s. But then the same phenomenon happened here as it happened with the other type of assertion, is that more recent types of works have refuted that particular type of observation. However, more recent work using more recent data seem to reaffirm this particular type of relationship. In particular, this paper in 2023, using European and US data for a large number of observations, what did they find? So they look at air pollution. They are looking at SO2 emissions. They are looking at other types of pollutants out there, which are air pollutants. And what do they find? They find that population and income are important factors. What do they find is that if you look at population intensity, the higher the population intensity, then the phenomenon happens over there. So then you have essentially that shape, the inverted U. And also for income, they also find this type of relationship. Now, this relationship, according to all the other papers, does not seem to be true for CO2 emissions. And so there is a key difference between CO2 and these other types of pollutants. These other types of pollutants affect regionally the populations, so they care about ambient quality. CO2 emission, we have a free riding effect because it affects everybody in the globe. Now, can we connect this with this? I think that there is a very interesting connection over here. So if you look at who benefited from the most recent types of economic growth, the top income earners. Who would be among the population who have the highest demand for environmental quality? The top income earners. So they would be the ones who would be pressing the government to implement regulations in order to have a cleaner environment, clean air. Because as an economist, what we observe is quality of the environment is what we call a normal good. So as income increases, the demand for that particular commodity increases. More recently, with another co-author, we have looked at the relationship, or trying to answer this question: does the energy transition affect food prices and agricultural production in OECD nations? And what we have found is that yes, it does. What we have found is that the energy transition increases food prices. Why is that? There are some potentials over here, is that there might be some competition for land use. There might be other types of phenomena as well in terms of looking at the energy transition. The electrification may actually lead to increases in the cost of living. So the paper shows that the impact varies depending on the stage of the energy transition. So it's higher in countries further along the transition. So that's an unintended consequence of well-intended policy, that we should incentivize electrification in order to reduce pollution, emissions of CO2. one would have to take that into account. Now, addressing the last question that over there, so if not taxation, what should be included in the policy mix? So given the results that we have learned, then education reform. We should not leave the kids behind. So if the top income earners are the ones who are benefiting from the economic growth, what are the types of skills that they actually possess? Those should be taught in universities. Social security reform, the grading of the population. Retired population, they are in fixed incomes. So if a fraction of the population is having rising incomes, then naturally we're going to have disparities. Fixed and rising, so then the income disparities would increase. But agreeing the population in the social security system, who is going to finance the social security? The productive individuals in society. If we tax them very heavily, what's going to happen? They go away. So one would have to take into account that particular phenomenon as well. Third, well-informed electrification of the economy. So what's well-informed? Well, you take into account the potential trade-offs that I just mentioned, but then there is also another potential trade-off. When we think in terms of electrification, we are not necessarily considering, say, what are the impacts upstream, like in the mining of critical minerals. So if we take a look at what happens over there, there's a lot of pollution. Water pollution, CO2 emissions, that has to be taken into account. So if we want to think in terms of policy, we have to take into account the trade-offs. Climate change versus regional types of pollutants. Fourth, this is in principle. I've done a lot of work, theoretical work, in trying to align incentives of nations that may participate in a global agreement towards reducing CO2 emissions. What might be effective? Well, there might be transfers necessary from rich countries to poor countries. But how can they be implemented? There are some mechanisms that are being discussed right now. Some of them might be like climate clubs that may involve questions of trade versus questions of environmental concern. But the key issue is that transfers, if implemented, they should be conditional. So you make a transfer, but then you require action. And that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
And I think we'll follow the routine from the first session. We'll save all our questions for once our presenters have come up. So please join me in welcoming Lynn Riggs to the floor.
So some of my work has been on distributional impacts, both of carbon policies, but of other types of policies as well. And so just to set the stage a little bit, a couple of the common arguments against carbon policies are that they put a greater burden on lower income households, and they are likely to have, or expected to have, negative effects on jobs, businesses, and GDP. However, previous research has shown that these policies can be progressive, especially if you have additional measures that can offset some of those negative effects. Research has also shown that the net employment effects are generally small. Most job loss, not all job loss, but most job loss is usually due to less hiring and not due to separations. There's also evidence to show that broader policies can have fewer net effects than more targeted policies, which seems counterintuitive, but it's because if you have broader policies that are affecting more aspects of the economy, that gives workers who are being in areas of negative effects places to go with positive effects. And so it allows that transition of workers, which has a cost, right? But it gives them more positive effects that they can move into. There's a report by the High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing and Competitiveness that says that research has shown that well-designed carbon policies can be consistent with growth, development, and poverty reduction. If you haven't seen that report, it's also known as the Stern-Stiglitz report. I would highly recommend you take look at that. So they talk about carbon prices as being integral in these types of policies, but they also talk about the need to have non-price interventions as well. Another aspect that's often not included in some of these analyses is some of the health benefits, for example, that can come from having less pollution. So one evaluation of fuel taxes in the US found that the taxes were actually cost savings when you included health benefits than if you didn't. And so it's about looking at that whole package, right? You want to look at all of the costs and all of the benefits when you're looking at the effects of these policies. Joseph Stiglitz, who is one of the co-authors of the Stern-Stiglitz report and also a Nobel Prize laureate, says that this more nuanced policy approach, while important, requires a greater understanding of the structure of the economy and of those distributive effects of the policies than an approach that relies simply on carbon taxes. So it's really important that when you're implementing these types of policies, that you not only consider those distributional impacts, but you understand the structure of the economy and how it's likely to respond. Otherwise, you end up having some of those unintended consequences. And even in some of the policy effects, there is a lot of nuance, and it can be very confusing for people when listening to these kinds of discussions. In general, in developed countries, it's pretty much regarded that the carbon tax burden from domestic energy consumption tends to be regressive. However, taxes on electricity are generally more regressive than taxes on heating fuels. And transport fuel taxes are generally not regressive. They tend to be either neutral or progressive, depending on the situation. Just taking into account all of those different aspects of what's being taxed and how it's being taxed is really important to understand how that's going to play out in terms of household budgets and business budgets, right? It's really, really important to think about all of these different aspects. So for example, in New Zealand, lower income households are more likely to live in rentals, which tend to be colder, damper, moldier, right? Less energy efficient often. And so that adds to their options, so they often have less ability to not only absorb those increases in the prices, but they also have less resources to respond to them. And that's where some of those redistributional aspects come in. So what can be done? One of the big things that is talked about in the literature is combining policies that complement the carbon pricing or carbon taxes. Stiglitz argues in a follow-on paper that he does after the Stern-Stiglitz report that simple regulations to induce a shift to preferred technologies can actually be faster, more efficient, less uncertain, and have fewer distributional effects than carbon pricing. So we often think of carbon pricing as being the most efficient, and it is, right? But there's these other negative aspects that you have to take into account when you're thinking about implementing these types of policies. The Stern-Stiglitz report talks about ways to recycle revenues from carbon taxes that can be reinvested. You can do in-kind or in-cash transfers. You can invest in social safety nets, education, health. You can do wage subsidies in growth sectors to help absorb some of those workers that are losing their jobs in declining sectors, right? You can have R&D and innovation. You can have infrastructure investments to accelerate growth in certain industries or certain regions that are being most negatively affected. These are those offsetting measures that can help reduce the negative distributional impacts that we see with some of these policies. And I just wanted to add, in my distributional impacts hat, it's not limited to climate policy, right? It did an evaluation of supply shocks, right? And it has some different employment effects, but those effects ripple throughout the economy, right? So even though specific sectors may be hit by a specific shock, eventually those changes have to get absorbed in the rest of the economy. And we have to think about that. So we really need to consider all of the costs and all of the benefits of these different types of policies. And my research had, we really want to build on that previous research. But as we do that, we have to think about how that really applies to the New Zealand situation. We can't just look at, say, a US paper and think that it's necessarily going to apply here, especially when low-income houses here tend to be much more dependent on electricity for heating, for example. There's also ways that policy design can help impact those distributional outcomes, and it's really important, I think, for policymakers to get that public support for policies. And I've had somebody tell me, well, politicians just need to do the right thing, but it really helps if the public sees the benefits. And one thing that worries me is just misinformation and disinformation in this space. And I think it's really important to fight that effect and go back to some of what the research says and try to show the public why these policies are so critical to the future. That's it. Thank you.
And I'd like to now invite David to the floor.
Kia ora tātou. My name is David Hall, and my affiliation has been identified as AUT, over the road, which is not wrong. I teach a course over there, Climate Action, which integrates the social sciences of climate action. But that's all I do there really now. And I'm going to talk about my other roles. First, as a co-founder of Rewiring Aotearoa, and second, as a policy director with the Toha Network. And this is me stepping into not just theorising about climate action, but doing climate action. And I think through all of that, through the theory and practice, one theme that stays with me, I think, is just transitions. It's sad that that concept has become politicised, because I think it is a universal challenge. Every party's constituency faces pressures and sources of tension around transitions, and all of those parties are going to have to be sensitive to those stresses in their own electorates and constituencies. I think it's helpful just to distinguish just transitions from climate justice. Climate justice is much more taking those concepts of justice and applying them to the impacts of climate change. Where are the impacts being distributed? What parts of the world face harsher impacts than others? Just transitions is much more around thinking about justice in terms of action and transitions, the doing, and recognising that that doing can also present and trigger tensions and forms of unfairness, forms of injustice. And it's crucial to recognise that, because when people feel that unfair and unjust things are being done to them, they fight back, they push back, there's a backlash. And that means that the transition starts facing headwinds, and the transition that you're trying to precipitate slows down or won't happen or might even go backwards. You get a backfire effect. There's multiple dimensions to a just transition. I think, recognition is an important justice-related concept, recognising that different groups will face different effects from these transitions. If you're disabled, then the shift from private vehicles to public transport may raise different sorts of challenges, getting access onto buses or trains in a wheelchair and so on, so keeping these considerations front of mind. Another dimension is representation. Do people feel that their own perspectives and their own ideas are contributing to the decisions around the design of the transition, how it's been undertaken? Are they being allowed to participate in relevant decision making? But the theme today is really distributional impacts. What are the costs and benefits of undertaking that transition? Where are those costs and benefits falling? Are they exacerbating and intensifying existing inequalities? Are they justice aligned in the way that we're using the transition to deal with historical inequities and using that as an opportunity to address those? These are the sorts of considerations we need to think about. Let me turn to Rewiring Aotearoa. So, as I said, I'm a co-founder of that and a policy advisor, and our mission is to electrify nearly everything. Nearly recognising that there's some industrial processes and long-haul aviation and so on which is unlikely to be electrified. But recognising that most other things could be electrified. And a major focus for us is the electrification of homes, farms, small businesses, private vehicles, and so on. And if you actually think about our total emissions, and especially our domestic emissions, where we have, as consumers and as citizens, the greatest decision power, especially those decisions being made at the dinner table about, whether to install rooftop solar, whether to get a home battery, whether to switch from a fossil car to an electric car. These are all decisions being made at the dinner table. And those decisions actually account for about 31% of our domestic emissions, so not including those emissions that we're exporting overseas, especially agricultural emissions. So there's a significant amount of relatively low-hanging fruit in this sector if we can transition homes and private vehicles to the electric equivalents. Lynn touched a bit on this when she was mentioning the work by Joseph Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern, that one of the things which makes this area quite enjoyable is that technology changes are such that an incredibly positive economic story is emerging, where it's not just about reducing emissions, it's about also reducing cost of living, reducing expenditure in different ways. Rewire in Aotearoa did some calculations around what people are spending on the energy in homes and vehicles. The average cost of energy from the electricity from the grid is sort of in the region of 30 cents per kilowatt hour. But if you have rooftop solar, battery, electric vehicle, rooftop solar, you're kind of getting that electricity for around 11 cents per kilowatt hour on average. That's going to obviously vary depending on the circumstances of the house. So it's much cheaper electricity, and then if you're combining that with a battery and combining that with an electric vehicle, driving some serious cost savings. The costs of petrol are some of the highest energy-related household costs that people bear. In our most recent report, we calculated that New Zealanders are spending all up around $20 billion a year on fossil fuels, and a large portion of that annual expenditure can be avoided through electrification. If we just focus on homes and private vehicles, then we could feasibly and have an ambitious electrification transition. We could potentially avoid fossil fuel costs of about $10 billion a year by the late 2030s. And that's not even to include also the opportunities to switch off fossil fuels through industrial transitions and adoption of new technologies in those sectors. So we could drive down that annual expenditure quite significantly, and then decouple ourselves from geopolitical dependencies and volatilities of international markets, which also have challenges, as we all know. There is a potentially positive story here where some of the financial stress that many homes face today could be alleviated. Lynn also mentioned the cost of air pollution. We don't consider all of these costs, but one study done in New Zealand by a group called Happens estimated that in 2016 the health-related costs of air pollution, mostly from nitrogen oxide from fuel emissions, cost about $15.6 billion that year. These calculations are always questionable, but it gives you a sense of the impact from respiratory disorders, time away from lost economic productivity, the health burden that is associated with that. So there's multiple benefits. The challenge, of course, is many of the households who would benefit most from that alleviation of financial stress are in the worst position to be able to afford all of the kit, the rooftop solar, the battery, the electric vehicle. And so technology is such that a lot of this is being market driven, and the cost of this technology will come down. But as it stands, if we just leave that transition to happen through these innovation and market processes, it'll be wealthy and well-to-do households that electrify, and low-income households will be left to face those volatilities of fossil fuels, those ongoing costs of fossil fuels, the price volatility that's associated with them, and the increasing price that may eventuate as a result of policy, including the emissions trading scheme, which in principle should increase the price of those fossil fuels. And so we need a policy mix. We clearly don't have the right one currently around Auckland. I think it's about 2% of households have rooftop solar, and you look at Melbourne, same latitude, similar sunshine hours. Western Melbourne suburbs have solar penetration about 40%, about 30% across Victoria. Quite a difference. They began with subsidies, so that obviously has made a big impact, and that's also driven down the cost of installation and created economies of scale, which has a self-perpetuating momentum. We don't have that here yet. The costs of installation are high. The risks of not having a good job done are also high, as I found out anecdotally. There's significant work to do, and I think there's a real risk that the way that this transition may play out, if we don't take a more deliberate, intentional approach to it, it's going to put pressure on the people who are least able to respond. And let me turn now to Toha. There's a similar challenge there, just transition-related challenge, as farmers and other landowners face different sorts of pressures. Some of them are regulatory, and you will hear complaints about the new burden of regulation and collecting information and so on to meet different regulatory standards. That's also increasingly coming through markets. It's not just a problem coming from governments. Big businesses, big international companies which buy our produce are expecting to know what their Scope 3 emissions are through their supply chains and to get a sense of their climate impact across their value chain. And they're also increasingly under expectation to disclose climate and nature-related impacts, risks and opportunities in their value chains, and to incorporate that data in their financial disclosures. Here we have a regulatory regime for climate risk-related disclosures, and this voluntary regime around nature-related risk disclosures is following up. This also has challenges. The idea of this is to transition the agriculture and the land use sector towards better sustainability outcomes. But for the people on the ground, the farmers, the foresters and so on, it's putting an enormous amount of pressure on them to collect data for large companies and to send that back upstream. Another burden which is being put on the people who are often have the least capabilities, the least time, the least resources to be able to deliver that. So what Toha is doing is developing digital public infrastructure to join up that supply and demand for this data. The companies have the demand, people at the front line have the supply of nature positive impact. They've got the capacity to go out there and make the landscapes more resilient, make them more biodiverse. And our infrastructure enables that supply and demand to find one another. We have new forms of measurement. We have a measurement platform that enables farmers and other landowners to track changes on farm and on site. We have a data sharing network which enables them to send the data up the supply chains, and because we are a Māori-led organisation, that data sharing has been designed taking Indigenous data sovereignty into consideration so that that data is treated with due respect for the mana that the data carries from the ecosystems and species which it represents. And we also have a digital payment system, so we're using digital currencies to enable those companies to pay back down the supply chain for the data that they need to make their financial disclosures. And in that regard, creating that circle, that virtuous circle, again, we are a Māori-led company, and so the design of our system has been informed by Māori economic concepts, which Dan was alluding to earlier, ideas of the economy of mana, tau utu, an economy of reciprocity, understanding that there's a need for benefit sharing. If these large companies are expecting this data, they ought to be investing downstream to enable that to happen. Our first pilot for this system, we will hopefully, touch wood, be announcing next week in a Māori land block at the very tip of the East Cape, Te Kotuku. It fulfills a recommendation which we were named in the Ministerial Inquiry into Land Use, recommendations to deliver a co-investment pilot in that region for whenua Māori to also help whānau hapu to overcome some of the financial barriers that they face for getting access to capital for developing whenua Māori. So that's how we're using this system, this digital public infrastructure, and enabling a more just and fair way for people to respond to the challenges that we face around both climate change and biodiversity loss. So, ngā mihi koutou.
If you missed part 1 of this symposium, you can find this on Ngā Ara Whetū's channels on Spotify, Apple or YouTube.